I will be reading Numbers 14, 20 through 25. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of God, of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times. Not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out towards the desert along the route to the Red Sea.
Thank you, Titan. Good job reading. About a month ago, I had informed you that our lessons were going to be taken from the same chapters that our young people are studying for the LTC convention coming up at the end of the month. And those chapters were in Exodus, chapters 1 through 20. Here in Numbers, we're looking at chapters 10 through 14, and then there's a few chapters in Deuteronomy. But the lesson this morning I want us to grasp is these 10 times that God said to the children of Israel that they have tested the Lord. And 4 of those, I believe, are within the reading of chapters 10 through 14 of Numbers. And so I think it's helpful, at least in my mind, to try to put a particular incident to these 10 times that God says that you have tested me. And I know this is going to be a little bit subjective on my part, in that on the first one that we go to, you may or may not think that that is one of the times. But we can clearly see, I think, the final 4, number 7, 8, 9, and 10 within these chapters of 10 through 14 of Numbers. And I hope that you're staying with us, that you appreciate these lessons, because I do believe there is much that God, in dealing with the Israelites, that we can learn from those situations. The Red Sea parting, I think, is the first time that the people disappointed God, and that's in Exodus chapter 14, and that might be a little baffling to us at first, but you remember how they felt on the shore as God had purposely led them to that spot. And if you know where I'm coming from on this, then Paul, whenever he mentions in Galatians chapter 3 that Mount Sinai is in Arabia, I believe that Mount Sinai is where the Bible puts it, and not where man puts it. And if you were to look at a map, and we could go a little bit more in depth on this if you would like, but really I think because Moses was on Mount Sinai whenever God had said to him that you are going to return to this mountain, remember that promise that he had made, and that you are going to worship me on this mountain. And so that rather than Mount Sinai being on the peninsula, which if you look at a map of the Middle East, you'll see it way down there towards the south. I believe that Mount Sinai is where the Bible puts it, and it's in the land of Midian, and rather than going so far south, they actually go east and they cross the Gulf of Aqaba, and that Mount Sinai is actually in modern day Saudi Arabia. But as they were led to that particular spot, there is a place there, and even within the sea there at the Gulf of Aqaba, they have found what looks to be tattered remnants of a junkyard of some sort with corals all over, and they just so happen to look like chariot wheels and axles right there within that spot. But as they were led to that spot, God does that on purpose because the land kind of narrows down into what is called a wadi. And then there is a wadi exit where the walls are on either side, and the children of Israel would have been on a beachhead that was indefensible with their back to the sea there as Pharaoh approached, and God led them to that place on purpose. But what he got was displeasing. He got a fearful people, so that whenever he says, stand back and watch and I will deliver you, and he discomforts the Egyptians, and during the night putting a cloud between them, and then he had Moses hold out his rod and his staff, and he had a strong wind blow upon the sea, and the children of Israel cross on dry land. A demonstration of power? Absolutely. Not just initially to impress the children of Israel, but to continue to impress. And the reason that I say continue to is because what have they witnessed within the land of Egypt? They have already seen the hand of God with the 10 plagues, and God said that these plagues will demonstrate to the world that I am Jehovah. Guess who else is supposed to be learning a lesson right there with Pharaoh? And the Egyptians did learn that lesson. If you remember, God says, if you will not listen, I will slay your firstborn. And guess who else is supposed to be listening? I think God is upset with them at this moment, but how does he respond? I think this is something that you need to look at. How does God respond in the first 4 incidents? He responds in this way by parting the Red Sea. Very benevolent, because he is causing his children to lean upon him. In Exodus chapter 15 and verse 23, can you imagine trying to find water for 2 million people and carrying bottled water back to them? And there might be some discussion about this, but there are 600,000 fighting men. And so you possibly have a group of 2 million people. And how would you carry enough bottled water in order for them to drink? And after all, it would be probably animal skins that they would be carrying the water in. But they come to a place where water is present, but it is bitter, in the way that you can remember this place's name, which is Mara. If you remember Naomi, whenever her name meaning pleasant, had gone to Moab and had a life that was very difficult. As she came back, she desired for them to call her Mara, because life has been bitter. She hadn't had that pleasant life. But the people here, they are complaining. You ever been in a place where you tried to drink the well water? Maybe it is city water. There was a time here in Wichita where the city water, after the algae would bloom out there on the lake, it would start to taste awful. I don't know if they have corrected that or what, but it seemed like you couldn't filter it out. You had to almost buy bottled water. Well, God purifies the water for them here, but nonetheless, the people show their doubts in God's provision. How does he provide? Well, he makes the water sweet. In chapter 16, they're in the wilderness whenever they begin to complain about food. You know, these guys sound like a bunch of teenagers, don't they? They want some food. They want something to drink. And so they haven't had that sufficient food within their minds. And God provides again. What does he do this time? He gives them manna to eat, which stays with them throughout the wilderness wanderings. Another time, whenever they complain about water, they just don't have any of it at this point, and this place is called Meribah or Massa, and this is in Exodus chapter 17 and verse 2. God gives them water out of the rock, and Moses even strikes the rock. 10 times God said there in Numbers chapter 14 that you have tested me. Now that is God that is taking count. That is not man keeping count. And all we are trying to do is to find specific incidents to those 10 times. And you might say, yeah, but the 10 times is actually a figure of speech. And I wouldn't argue that point with you whatsoever, except that I can find 10 times that the Israelites tested the Lord. And so it helps me to kind of wrap my mind around this concept. But 10 times God says, you have tested me. Do you think he's keeping count of my testing? Do you think that I have only tested him 10 times? Do you think that I've tested him this past week? And you might say, well, what do you mean you put God to the test? Whenever Ethan was in preschool, his teacher, Mrs. Madison, was saying, we're doing testing this week. And as we had parent-teacher conferences, she wanted to share with us that after doing testing with Ethan, our little 4 or 5-year-old at that time, 5-year-old I think he was, he decided that he was going to test Miss Madison, and he had a set of questions that he was going to ask her. Is that how we put God to the test? We give him an SAT or an ACT? No, you put God to the test because he says, by your desires, remember, it's the eating, it's the drinking, it's the fearfulness. You, by your desires or by your doubts, express uncertainty and dissatisfaction in the way that I am providing for you and that I am protecting you. Now, if you want to go to sleep, that's the lesson in a nutshell. There it was, about in a sentence wrapped up. But when I doubt God's provision and protection, I put him to the test. Now, let me ask you again, if God is keeping count, how many times has Jed tested him? Why would it upset God so for his people to complain? Why would it upset God so to have his people wonder if he is going to fulfill his promises? Because it shows a clear lack of faith on their part. Now we change in the Spirit of God to a degree. God parted the Red Sea benevolently. He made the bitter water sweet. He gave them manna to eat. God had Moses strike the rock and he brought forth water. All very positive, right? What is God doing? He is establishing for his people that he cares. Does Jesus care? Certainly he does. But now things change. We are now at the foot of Mount Sinai. Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days, and clearly this has to be one of those times, does it not? That the people of Israel put God to the test. This is found in Exodus chapter 32, if you want to go there and read it. But Aaron makes a golden calf out of the jewelry that the people have brought to him. And God brings about swift judgment, and it has an edge. And at the edge of the sword, 3,000 die by the hands of the Levites, who then become the priests of God. Blood is spilt at the base of Mount Sinai. Now, if you don't think that there are some overtones here with the establishment of the old covenant in the old, with 3,000 losing their life at the base of Mount Sinai and 3,000 dying to self in that baptism of Christ on the day of Pentecost, I think you should look at it again, because what God said to the Egyptians was, if you don't serve me, if you don't obey me, if you don't let my people go, then I am going to take your firstborn. By the way, they belong to me anyways. Here, God takes 3,000 to establish that he is God for his people. Then again, the sixth time that God is tested, this time by two of his priests who have recently been consecrated by the names of Nadab and Abihu, and this is taken from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. They offer strange fire to the Lord, and God strikes again fear into the hearts of the people by sending fire to consume them. I assume that's to develop a respect for God and to obey his commandments and to worship him in the way that he desires. But he sends fire and he consumes Nadab and Abihu. In Numbers chapter 11, we have another gripe session, another complaining session, if you will, with the children of Israel that they go into. They complain of their misfortune, and this time God strikes the camp itself, Terabah, and many die because God is displeased. 10 times God said, you have tested me. They complain, and this time not because they don't have anything to eat, but because they don't have anything like meat to eat. You know, we've been eating this manna, and it's getting a little bit loathsome, they say. We've tried to make it all sorts of ways, and we just need something new. Does this sound like your house? I don't want what you're putting in front of me. Ooh, I don't like that. In your house, do you make 5 meals for the different individuals? Is that the way it goes? And our house growing up, there was like 7 of us around the table, and so guess what? You got what was put in front of you, or you didn't get anything at all. Well, the Israelites have had manna set before them, and they say, we need something more. And Moses' response to the Lord is, how in the world am I supposed to find meat for all of these people? And so what does God do for them? This is from Numbers chapter 11. If you look further in verses 31 through 35, you see what he sends to them, but quail. Now, I like quail. Fairly good bird. You know, my dad is the hunter of the family, and so when we go up to his house, he always has pheasant fingers and dove and quail and different types of bird that we can eat pretty good. But would you like to have it on a daily basis? Because God says, I am going to give them a lust for eating. Now, the Romans, by the way, this is kind of a side note, the Romans kind of really perfected this, and even within their architecture, they came up with things called a vomitorium or vomitoria. and even within the Colosseum, to where they could banquet and they could drink, and then they could go over and throw up, and so that they could fill themselves up just a little bit more. And I know that that's gross. Well, God says to the Israelites that I am going to make you eat until you have quail coming out of your nose. And I'm not sure if you can quite eat like that. I think that just means I'm going to make you eat so much of it that you're vomiting it up and it's coming out of your nose, and then you're going to eat some more, and then you're going to eat some more. And then God did send a plague to the people to destroy some of them in that as well, because they tested God. God gave it to them straight, and then they found out that their desires are not actually good for them. They had gone too far in their complaints to God. That was number 8, which is understandable, right? 8 made, and they ate the quail. There you go. You got a little. Okay. Number 9 was an incident that was rather unusual, unless you consider sibling rivalry to be a usual thing. But because this happens, there is Moses within the position of leadership. He is challenged by both his brother and his sister, Miriam and Aaron. And in Numbers chapter 12, the first couple of verses, they decide that they don't like the way that Moses has married the Cushite woman, and they believe that he has taken on too much authority in leading the people by themselves. And so they accuse Moses of assuming too much. And so God calls the 3 of them into the tabernacle, and he meets with him there, and he puts Miriam and Aaron within their place, and he says, I am the one that has chosen Moses, and I will speak to him as I have always spoken to him, face to face. And in the process, what happens to Miriam? She becomes leprous, and then I believe that's enough of a punishment upon Aaron, because Aaron then becomes one that is mediating on the behalf of Miriam to Moses to mediate to God to bring her leprosy away from her. And he does, but it's not until after a week of being unclean, because what God says is even if her father would have spit in her face, she would have been unclean for a week. And so she will remain outside the camp for a week, and the entire nation of Israel waits for that week of uncleanness of Miriam before she can come back into the camp. Now, what that tells us is that leadership is vital to God's people, and the establishment of the chain of authority is absolutely necessary in God's people. And when God has determined that there is a man to be the leader of the people, then it's not within the people's rights to rebel against what God has established and to try to usurp that with their own authority or leadership. Remember, Moses was probably not as qualified for the position whenever God called him. He says, I am not able to speak. It was his brother Aaron who was able to speak, and yet God chose Moses. And what was it that Moses told the people in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15? God says, I will rise up another one like unto you from amongst your brethren, and when he comes, listen to him. God saying the Christ will be fulfilled within that prophet who is to come. And so what we have is a challenge certainly to Moses, but having the fulfillment even in Jesus Christ when the Jews are rejecting him, and the way that God responds to them, and of course the destruction of Jerusalem being the final culmination of all that. God upset with his people because they doubted his protection and his provision. They doubted his leadership, and so Miriam and Aaron, they have God clearly saying to them, you must follow the line that has been decided, and Moses is my man. And then finally we get to the incident, which is a little bit of a review of what we talked about last week with the 10 spies. What happens there? God said, one man from every tribe go out and spy out the land. 12 are selected. They go through the land. They spend 40 days within the land, and they come back carrying fruits on their shoulders. They say the land is flowing with milk and honey, but there's a problem. What's the problem? The cities are well fortified, that the people are giants. They make us look like grasshoppers. And the 10 spies say what? We will never make it. You ever gone on a trip with somebody like that? Boy, as soon as you get in the car or on the road, it seems like in no time they're saying, oh, can we get out of here? How long is this going to take? Oh, we're never going to make it. I hope you're not one of those types. These 10 spies, they carry the day for the people, and they convince the people that we can't do it. Well, why is that a challenge to God? Well, clearly they don't trust God to deliver them. And here they've complained because of their desires about his provision. Now, out of their fear and doubting, they complain about his protection. And so God says clearly, you have disappointed me, and you in your disappointment will now, this generation, spend 20 years and older in the wilderness wandering and never see the land of Canaan. And yet there is one, as I have right there on the overhead, there is one, and this is from Numbers chapter 14 and verse 24, where it says, "But as for my servant Caleb, because he has had a different spirit, and he has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it." Joshua and Caleb, I believe, but here specifically it says Caleb. What was it that they had about the others that they didn't have? He said a different spirit. What does that mean? He had a different spirit. I didn't mean he was of a different nation. He wasn't an Ethiopian or an Arab. What does it mean? Because Caleb had a different spirit. Well, we see God describe it. The spirit that Caleb had was in doing what? Obeying God. He had an attitude that said, if God wants it done, it's going to get done, and I'm going to see to it that it gets done. And he was obedient, and he followed to a letter what God would have him to do. Now, maybe you have had a child like that, one that is just a pleasant to be around, that as a parent that just desires to be around you. Maybe it's a daughter that follows you around as a mother. Maybe it's a father. You have your son that's in tow. Wherever you go, they just seem to want to be right there with you. But if you've had a child like that, then you know that they just want to please you. It doesn't matter. They just want to be close. That's what God is saying about Caleb. He is saying, man, that's my boy. That's what he wants. He wants nothing but to be with me and to do what I have said. And he might as well have said he obeys me and he yearns to please me. But you put it in the context of he's different. Different than who? God. He is being compared to a nation of people. Are we saying that Caleb is of a different spirit than hundreds of thousands of different Israelites? I mean, we are only probably about a year away from the Exodus. And in fact, as we start those few chapters that we see in Numbers in chapter 10, you see that they are at the base of Mount Sinai and they spend a good year there. They celebrate the Passover recently. They've spent that time receiving the law, getting organized, establishing and building the tabernacle, making sure the priesthood knows all of their positions and the things and responsibilities that they are supposed to do. And then they move to the land of Canaan. And we might say, well, wait a minute, what about these 40 years here? Well, God had said, you go back into the wilderness because you have lack of faith and doubted that I would deliver you. Back into the wilderness you will go for 40 years. We know what's going on. God is leading them out there on purpose. And why? Because 10 times, he says, you have tested me. Guess what? Aside from Joshua and Caleb, Moses doesn't make it into the land of Canaan. Miriam and Aaron, they are certainly ones, I believe, that make it through the time frame, but even they are not able to go in to. But 10 times he says, you have tested me and you failed, and you're not ready to conquer the land of Canaan. Your complaints have come to my ears, and they have disgusted me. Your fear has reached me, and I know that you don't trust me. Back into the wilderness you go. Have you ever felt like that you are wandering around in the wilderness? You ever felt like you're just not getting to where you want to go? And in fact, this sermon, it's not getting to the end like you would like for it to get to, just quick enough. Would he wrap it up already? You think, wow, I just wish he would. Could it be that our own desires and our own doubts are what is affecting our perception? That God has clearly said to us, those things that he desires of us, that he wants from you and I. If life doesn't look so good, then let me ask you, how quickly are you to become dissatisfied? How quickly are you one who complains? Do you see it as a cup half full or half empty? Are you one that can murmur very easily? Do you doubt God's provision as well as his protection? Out on the sign I have, all of God's people are to be of the same blood type. Be positive. You get it? Right? I actually have B positive blood. Anybody have B positive blood? Like the actual blood type? That's my blood type. But that's not what I'm talking about, is it? God wants us to look on the bright side of things. And this is what God is saying whenever he says in these chapters, 10 times you have put me to the test. 10 times I can specifically look at that you have complained and you have doubted me. And I have got to ask myself, Jed, do you fit that bill? Jed, are you a complainer? Is that your nature to be positive? Paul says in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 14 to do all things without grumbling and complaining. Now that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to us. They do. Bad things happen to good people. But my attitude should not be whenever they come of, oh God, why have you failed me? Or, oh God, you haven't given me that which I want. God, this is your fault. No, if that's my attitude, then back to the wilderness you go in wandering in sin, right? Isn't that what God is teaching us within this lesson? That bad things happen to people, but it's how I respond to them and whether I am of a different spirit or not. Do all things without grumbling or complaining. Have you seen those children? Aren't they a delight to be around? Ones that are just have joy in their life all the time, just that little boy or that little girl. Yeah, sure, they fall down. There might be a tear within their eye, but they don't get discouraged. They get right back up. They don't get depressed, but you've also seen the pouting Peters, haven't you? Oh man, I don't think that we can. Oh, why do we have to? I don't want to do that. And then you take away their iPad or their phone, and boy, they just lose their mind, don't they? But how does God perceive me? I mean, am I really one that is of a B positive blood type? Do all things without murmuring and complaining? Because I need to understand that God takes it personally. Debbie Downers are not pleasing to God, not what he wants. As an adult who does nothing but go through life with a diatribe of how things are going wrong is one who is still wandering within the wilderness of sin. Am I coming on too strong? I don't think so. I think that that's what God desires of his people. And in fact, he had said just a little bit earlier in Philippians chapter 2, so then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who is at work in you, both to desire and to work for his good pleasure. The children of Israel didn't wander 40 years in the wilderness by accident. God was working on them and killing anybody that was over the age of 20, so that by the time that they reached the land of Canaan, even Moses, Aaron, and Miriam don't get to go into the promised land. Only those two, and that generation, only those two faithful spies, specifically Caleb, is denoted there as having a different spirit. I think Joshua too is of that same type of spirit because he then becomes the leader of the people. But out of an entire group of 20 years old and older, only two, God says, may enter into the land of Canaan. Do you know what that says? It's only natural to complain, but it's not godly. Do you hear me? All of God's people are to have the same blood type. To be positive, to trust God, to walk with him, to remain obedient. Be thankful for everything that we have that is within the Lord. And then the last analogy is don't complain, but cast it. Are you a good caster? I'm not talking about like a wheel. Like a fishing. Are you a good caster? Because Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 5, what God desires for us to do is not to complain to him, but to cast things upon him. Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6, so that he may exalt you at the proper time, having cast all your anxiety upon him because he cares about you. Now, what that tells me is that God is not saying that I am oblivious to pain. God is saying, bring it to me. When those things go wrong, don't try to make out like a Debbie Downer that there's nothing right within the world, but take it to me. And it sounds an awful lot like a passage in the Old Testament in Psalm chapter 55 and verse 22. Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. You know, if the children of Israel would have understood that concept, to God be the glory, give it to God because he is going to take care of it, wouldn't they have approached life differently? How would their lives have been affected? I mean, they still would have been a little bit fearful at the Red Sea, right? But they would have been parted for them. They would have still been maybe without water for a time being, or it might have been a little bit bitter, and they might not have had quite the amount of food that they desired. They might have experienced a little bit of dissatisfaction with the manna. But how would that have manifested itself, say, at the foot of Mount Sinai, that whenever Moses has been gone for 40 days, instead of Aaron making a golden calf so that all the people can rise up and play in a lewd manner, what if in their worry they turn to God and they hit their knees in prayer? Boy, can you imagine the scene? If they would have gotten after the 10 plagues, that God is on their side and understood, after being given manna from heaven, after God making the waters sweet, don't you think they could have gotten it at some point? What if they would have just hit their knees and instead of complaining, they would have cast their care upon him? And again, I got to look at myself, don't I? What do I tend to do whenever I have trouble within my life? Whenever the burdens mount up, do I begin to complain or do I cast upon the Lord? Abraham cared enough about doing things God's way that he was willing to even sacrifice his son Isaac. Hannah, barren, being assaulted, if you will, by her rival Peninnah, called out to God, and God gave her a son. Jesus within the garden prayed, not my will, but thy will be done. Paul embraced being arrested as he went to Jerusalem because he knew this is the will of God. The Israelites, they gave themselves over to their desires. They failed to trust in God's provision and protection. They were unsatisfied and uncertain. We cannot be the same. We must be like Caleb. We must have a different spirit. Trust, confide within, meditate upon, and even being forgiving of one another as God is merciful with us. May it not be on the day of judgment that we are looked upon as those 10 other spies or those ones that wandered in the wilderness. Can you imagine, I know this isn't the way it's going to be, okay? But can you imagine on the day of judgment, God looking down at our little group here that we have at Emporia Avenue, and as he turns to judge, he says, this group. This group was a group that was of a different spirit. You took wholeheartedly my commands and you did them without punishment, without chastisement. This group, they were of a different spirit. I am so thrilled that you are here. Or is he going to say, 10,000 times you have put me to the test? What is he going to say? It is our choice. He calls to you to be his child. Won't you heed that call and be baptized into his blood today, having your sins washed away so that you might have the hope of eternal life, as we stand and as we sing.